Clash is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing another Sharks season in review, this time of the 11-12 season. So, of course, the Sharks were coming off of a strong but yet still disappointing finish to the previous year. In the 2011 playoffs, the Sharks would make it to this Western Conference Finals for a second year in a row, but would once again be knocked off, this time by the President's Trophy winning Vancouver Canucks in just 5 games, and coming off of an especially disappointing 5th game in which they lost in double overtime to a bit of a fluky bounce. So Doug Wilson was looking to make some change-ups to how the team would look going into the following year. The first trade would end up being a huge one that could potentially go down as the best trade of the decade for the San Jose Sharks and one of their best trades in franchise history. Up there with the Joe Thornton trade, although losing to that one certainly, when they acquired Brent Burns in exchange for Devin Setoguchi, a first-round pick, and Charlie Coyle. Now, Coyle would end up being a promising player, but Setoguchi would fall off pretty considerably. That first-round pick would not turn into anyone notable. And, of course, we know now just how good Brent Burns ended up being for the Sharks. The first couple of years were okay, but once really Dan Boyle retired and Brent Burns stepped into that role as a number one defenseman, we saw him in the 15-16 year, the 16-17 year, especially with the James Norris, cement himself as one of the best defensemen in the NHL, and at times the best defenseman, as I said, the James Norris in the 16-17 season. He would also make a trade just a few days later with the same team, the Minnesota Wild, trading Danny Heatley for Martin Havlat. This might seem sort of a sideways, if not somewhat downwards trade, but at the time Heatley had been declining somewhat. Heatley also had a much larger contract at the time, worth $7.5 million in terms of cap hit, while Martin Havlat was almost half of that. And so if Havlat could stay healthy, it would end up being a bit of a lateral move that would cost the Sharks a lot less money. Now, of course, the problem was Havlat couldn't seem to be able to play a full NHL season for any team he was on. He only played a couple of them, and this was no different. While he did put up 27 points in just the 39 games he played, which is a pretty impressive number, the fact that he only played 39 games is not a very good thing. Anyhow, the Sharks would end up coming 7th place in the Western Conference, a weird blip on a radar of which the Sharks were just having very strong regular season performances. Even with their first round exit in the 08-09 season, they were still a President's Trophy winning team. 09-10, they were the leading team in the Western Conference. 10-11, they were still a top team winning their division, and yet this season was sort of strange in that they ended up coming 7th place in the Western Conference, though funnily enough, right ahead of the Los Angeles Kings, who would end up winning the Stanley Cup that year. So the Sharks would come into a first-round matchup against the St. Louis Blues, who won the Central Division, as the underdog for the first time in a while. But not to get too ahead of ourselves, looking at the regular season point marks, the Sharks would once again not be super offensively skilled, but Thornton would lead the way with 82 games played, 18 goals, 59 assists for 77 points. Then Couture, sophomore season, doesn't seem to put the brakes on. 80 games played, 31 goals for 34 assists and 65 points. Marleau with another 82-game season, 30 goals, 34 assists for 64 points. Pavelski, 82 games played, hits the 30-goal mark with 31, 30 assists for 61 points. Dan Boyle once again up there, 81 games played, 9 goals, 39 assists for 48 points. And then Ryan Clough with 76 games played, 17 goals, 28 assists for 45 points. Niemi would, of course, still be the starter for the Sharks and start a whopping 68 games, which of course appears insane for the moment in the time we are in now, but just a few years ago it wasn't completely out of the ordinary to see a goaltender start that many games. 34 wins for him, a 2.42 GAA and a .915 save percentage. Also should remember, scoring back then in the NHL just a few years ago was a lot lower than it is now. So while these stats, I'd kill for Jones to have stats like these, they were a bit more average to maybe slightly above average at the time. Now, moving into the playoffs, as I said, the Sharks would face off against the St. Louis Blues. They'd be a bit of an underdog, and coming into that first game of the series, they'd come into St. Louis. They were on the road in this one, and they'd actually win the first game 3-2 in double overtime. It would actually be Martin Havlat with the overtime winner. And so people thought maybe, with the Sharks coming in as an underdog, since they had always been a big contender in the previous few years, though it never worked out, people thought maybe the Sharks could actually sneak out a couple of wins here, but that wouldn't end up being the case. After that first win, the Sharks would not win another game this series, losing 3-0 before returning home for 2 games in games 3 and 4, losing 4-3 and 2-1, and then a a final Game 5 in St. Louis, losing 3-1. So just a disappointing end to a pretty disappointing regular season for the Sharks. And as I said, sort of a weird bump in what was some pretty successful regular seasons and some decent playoff success as well for the Sharks. As I said, the Blues would eventually end up going on to the second round to face off against the Kings, who they would get completely destroyed by the Kings going on their way to the Stanley Cup, only losing just 4 games in that playoff year. So just domination from the Los Angeles Kings. So it's really hard to evaluate where the St. Louis Blues actually landed in terms of skill all around compared to the rest of the Western Conference, but still a second place finish in the Western Conference, nothing to scoff at. So the Sharks had their hands full. In the playoffs, Joe Thornton would lead the way for the Sharks. Everyone here would play all 5 games. 2 goals, 3 assists for 5 points. Logan Couture then with 5 games played, as I said, 1 goal, 3 assists, 4 points. Martin Havlat, 2 goals, 1 assist for 3 points. Now 2 of those goals did, of course, come in that first game. Ryan Clough with 0 goals, 3 assists for 3 points. Then Brent Burns, 1 goal, 1 assist for 2 points. And Dan Boyle, 0 goals, 2 assists for 2 points. Niemi would start all 5 games. He'd only, of course, win one of them, the first one, though his stats were still pretty solid with a 2.45 GA and a .914 save percentage. So, as I've said multiple times, a bit of a strange year for the San Jose Sharks. They'd go into the following one, they'd end up performing a lot better, but we'd also have some sort of strangeness happen there too. The first thing that, of course, comes to mind would be Brent Burns' transition to playing forward in the following year, and of course the fact that the following year only had 48 games played in the regular season before the playoffs would start. But that's another video for another time. Class dismissed.